Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going, a weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. Back with another episode of Gaming Outside the Algorithm. Goda is my solo cast, where I cover the business and technology of the video game industry, sometimes legal topics, and other things in between. So heads up, just at the outset of the show, I did not get a chance to do PC component pricing refresh tonight. Spent the entire time prepping for the PlayStation earnings discussion. I think that's going to go quite a while. So I will try and do PC component, PC template pricing refresh maybe after this or tomorrow and try and get it posted. So let's jump right in with the discussion of the PlayStation earnings. So based on the headlines that I saw and a few occasions of conversations that I had with friends and fellow content creators, I think my view on this will be a little different than a lot of other people's. So let's go ahead and get started. This first news story over on GameIndustry.biz. I think I'll go through a lot of the news stories first and then swing back with my own take. Ghost of Yotei boosts Sony's Q3 results, significantly contributed to 6% rise in digital game revenue. CFO Lin Tao also comments on ongoing memory shortage. New PS5 hardware sales will be impacted due to cost increases. Ghost of Yotei significantly contributed to Sony's third quarter financial results, with digital game and add-on content revenue rising 6% to $4.8 billion. I'm going to bypass reading the yen. $4.8 billion. During an earnings call, CFO Lin Tao also revealed that the Sucker Punch Productions title exceeded the sales of Ghost of Tsushima in the same period of time, having sold 3.3 million copies since its launch on October 2nd, 2025. Our established live service titles like Helldivers 2 and MLB The Show also contributed stable recurring revenue, Tao added. She also said Sony is very confident for Marathon's release on March 5th, 2026, following the delay to its original release date of September 23rd, 2025. So I want to go ahead and read the top of this article as well, also on GameIndustry.biz. PlayStation 5 unit sales drop during holiday period. Q3 hardware revenue down 15% to $3.9 billion. Sony has reported its financial results for the 9 months ended December 31st, 2025, experiencing a 21% increase in operating income overall. Its game and network services segment also saw a significant increase in operating income, rising 27% to $2.6 billion. However, the platform holder experienced a decline in hardware revenue, with unit sales of PlayStation 5 dropping 15.7%. Here's what you need to know. For the 9 months ended December 31st, 2025, sales up 2.3%, operating income up 21%, games and network services sales up 1.3%, operating income up 27%. Yeah, I'm not sure for the 9 months. Okay, for the 9 months. We'll get into that here in a little bit. Sony shipped 8 million PS5 units during the holiday period, a 15.7% drop compared to the 9.5 million units shifted by the end of its third quarter in December 2024. When taking the 9 months into account, PS5 shipped 14.4 million units compared to 15.7 million moved during the same period last year. Across this period, hardware sales amounted to $7.5 billion, a decrease of 8.5% year on year. Full game sales were 97.2 million units during the 3 months ended December 31st, 2025, with 13.2 million being first-party titles. Full game sales increased from 95.9 million sold in the same period last year, as did first-party software, which rose 11.6 million. The biggest first-party release during this period was Sucker Punch Productions' Ghost of Yotei, which has sold 3.3 million copies since its launch on October 2nd, 2025. Now, that figure was the figure that they reported in November of 2025 and has not been refreshed or updated, so we actually don't know what its total sales through has been to date. Okay. Let's go ahead and look at the earnings brief. In fact, I'm gonna bring this up on screen, but I am going to actually skip over to my notes to start the summary. So again, this is the start of my take. So revenue in Q3. So this is revenue to the games and network services segment, which is essentially PlayStation at Sony. Revenue in Q3 FY24 was $10.7 billion. Let's see if that, I don't know if my yen to dollars conversion matches theirs. We all reported different figures. That's the problem I have. No, we'll just leave it at that. I think my figures are right or close to it. So revenue in Q3 FY24 for the G and NS operating segment at Sony, which is PlayStation, was 10.7 billion US dollars. That was Q3 FY24. Revenue in Q3 FY25 was 10.3 billion US dollars. This represents a 3.74 to 4% loss in revenue year over year. So the common theme throughout this thread is I have a lot of issue with the way the media covered this topic this week. And even GameIndustry.biz, who I really have a very high regard for, if you notice, the numbers they reported in at least one of their, in the first article that I read, was, so Japanese companies, or at least I think companies under IFRS, and Nintendo did the same thing. They report this 9-month reporting period, right? So the first 3 quarters of the fiscal year, instead of, well, in Nintendo's case, that's what they reported, instead of really breaking out Q3 as a standalone. Sony does both, but it was very curious that GameIndustry.biz seemingly deliberately chose to take the 9-month reporting and report that as the top level number instead of reporting the Q3 number, which is just weird. So in the first article I read, in the second article I read rather, that was actually the first article that was posted. So the difference between those two articles was the second one that I read was actually the early article they posted. And that's the one that they post without really having done any analysis. It's just basically a report summarizing what's in their earnings slides and whatever maybe went down at the webcast. So I think that one may have even been posted before the webcast, because the sequence of events was the material, the collateral got posted probably 2 or 3 hours before the webcast went down, and then the webcast went down. So that first article was the part of the first wave, the flurry of articles that went up like the moment any earnings information was posted. And then that the first article I read was actually the second article that was posted, which is the article that they post once they've had time to kind of chew on some of the data. So my point is that it seems like the media and many content creators talked about all of the positives with regards to this earnings report. And I think that's bad. And look, you can be a fan of the brand, but I think an important part of the conversation that we're having sometimes is where these companies really sit on the landscape of the gaming industry. And I think you get a kind of contorted picture if you only present the positives associated with this report. I don't think there's a ton of, I mean, it's fine to talk about like the report for Xbox and the report for PlayStation. There's a few things I don't care about. Like when I'm looking at PlayStation, I don't really care how PlayStation is doing in comparison to Xbox, and vice versa. I also want to talk about this a little bit later. I don't really care how well the PlayStation 4 sold. Like, we're not selling the PlayStation 4 anymore. We're selling the PlayStation 5. And we're in the 9th console generation. And how things are going now is pertinent versus how things were going right last generation. Sometimes some of those metrics, some of those KPIs are relative to give context to the picture, but they aren't always. So we'll get to that a little bit later. So at any rate, the big, huge takeaway, the most important thing that I took away from these Q3 results was the top level number. the PlayStation was down 4% on revenue year over year out of the holiday quarter. And we made a very, very big deal about Xbox earnings and how it was the eye on that was so impactful because it was reporting out of the holiday quarter, which, as I said last episode, you could argue if you were a consumer electronics company, for a tech company, for a consumer electronics company, right, in the tech space, that is their most important quarter. That's the quarter that is the most significant, maybe the only thing that's significant. That all the other stuff is just warm up, scrimmage, practice, right? And that if you do well those 3 quarters, but then you still stumble in the holiday quarter, that's a problem. That's kind of like, you go 16-1, 17-1, whatever, and lose the first round of the playoffs, right? You have a winning record and then you lose the wild card. So big takeaway here is, let's start off at the top. 4% loss on revenue. Now, operating income is a good news story, is a great news story. Quite frankly, I think Totoki should be given a 4-day weekend, right? Operating income, which is, and let's cover it a little bit. Operating income is what many refer to simply as profit. So gross profit is simply revenue minus cost of goods sold. So sales minus cost of goods sold. Operating income is gross profit minus operating expenses minus depreciation minus amortization. I'm not going to get into depreciation and amortization tonight. I'm also not going to get into how interest and taxes figures into all this and the difference between gross profit, operating profit, EBIT, and EBITDA. I hated that when I had to go through it. I'm not going to go into it tonight. But basically, operating income, which is really your measure of operational efficiency, right, in terms of executing on the business plan, is gross profit minus your, I think what we call S&GA, which is your, or SG&A, I can't remember which it is, sales and general expenses, which basically means your expenses associated with your corporate staff, all of your supporting activities, your IT, things of that nature. So you take that out, you pay your bills essentially, and then you take into account depreciation and amortization, which is included in operating income because those are factors driven by investments that you've made, and purchases that you've made for not necessarily durable goods, but goods that last longer. So it includes investment in long-term software development, right? And how you depreciate those costs and how you spread capital expenses out over a number of years in order to not pay it all back at one time. So operating income, which is essentially profit, right? Like I said, is gross profit minus operating expenses minus depreciation minus amortization. That operating income figure is important because it's a figure that Sony, PlayStation, fixated on as a thing that they needed to work on. Okay, so operating income was $759 million US dollars in Q3 FY24. In Q3 FY25, it was $895.5 US dollars. So that is about a 19.24% increase. Forward guidance for revenue, and this is also huge, and a thing which was not discussed in the media, and I would venture to say around 90% of the content creator circles as well, or actually I'd probably say 99% of the content creators. This might be the only place you're coming to hear this part of this discussion. Forward guidance for revenue, right, was revised, and the revision isn't as important, but the point is that forward guidance revenue, because we're 3 months now from closing out the fiscal year for Sony, so where they project to be is at 29.5 billion US dollars at the end of their fiscal year. Operating income is projected to be at 3.24 billion US dollars. So they are going to be, damn it, sorry. No, I actually did calculate it. So at the end of this year, they're projecting that they're going to be down on revenue by 8 to 10% in comparison to FY24. 8 to 10% is not a small figure. It's not a small miss. Again, operating margin is a great story. Operating margin, operating income. So operating margin, which is, I didn't write the calculation down here, I think is operating income operating income over revenue. So operating margin is projecting to be 11%. Recall last year in the multiple meetings, in the investor week meeting especially, that they were coming in at about 6%, right through the earnings calls and the investor week. They were coming in at about 6%. And Totoki, actually, one of the things that he said that was correctly quoted, because there were lots of things that Totoki said last year that were misquoted, misinterpreted. Totoki said that their goal was to improve on profit margin. I'm pretty sure at one point it was directly said that the goal was to get that to double digits, right? To get that up to like 10, 11, 12%. They're at 11%. So they recognized the discrepancy last year, they targeted it, they improved on it, and they met that goal. That is huge, because that is money that gets returned to the company and is now available for R&D, capital expenses, i.e. funding software development. I think I got a few comments last year that somebody tried to tell me that PlayStation couldn't afford to fund first-party games. That seems not be the case, because they have 11% margin. Like I said, R&D, software development, raises for people, right? That's money in the coffers. And for PlayStation, as the lead business unit within Sony, that's money that they are contributing back to the mothership. Well, hold on. Let's go back and talk about the slides and just quickly run through them. So I think most of that will match with what my own calculations were. Yeah, I mean, they have the figures here, but they didn't present the calculations to show right their actual impact. So these things are quoted in billions of yen, not converted to dollars here. So it's only moderately useful, but these are the inputs that I used for my calculations. Like I said, this is where they're reporting their fiscal year guidance, FY 2025 results forecast for continuing operations, including the tariff impact. And now these figures, well, that's corporate. Okay, this is at the segment level. So at the segment level, these are increases from their most recently provided guidance back in November. So they're projecting 160 billion more yen in sales and 10 billion more yen in operating income in profit. So again, those things are good. Game and network services segment, and this is kind of the I shouldn't say subjective stuff, but this is kind of more of the story stuff than just the numbers. And so you can see in the graph the decrease in net sales, the increase in operating income and margin. Q3 FY 2025 year on year. Sales 4% decrease. That's overall for the division. Again, a negative contributing factor was decrease in sales of hardware due to a decrease in unit sales. A positive factor was impact of foreign exchange rates. On operating income, 19% increase. What did I say in my notes? I said 19.24%. Yes, 19.24% operating income. So Sony and I agree. Contributing factors were positive impact of foreign exchange rates, impact of increase in sales from network services, impact of increase in sales of first-party game software titles. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Negative impact from an increase in losses from hardware. Okay, I think that's really the only things that are kind of pertinent in the slide deck. So let's go back to my notes and really start breaking it down. Comments from Lin Tao, CFO of Sony. Her comments were, however, when we talk about hardware and, whether that's a bad news story or a good news story, her comments were, however, and I'm adding this negative downturn in hardware, it's in the latter part of the life cycle. So that means that in terms of hardware sales, it's been expected all along that it will gradually decline or slow down. So there are several or a wide range of choices or options that we can take. Earlier, her comment was, given the stage of our console cycle, our hardware sales strategy can be adjusted flexibly, and we intend to minimize the impact of the increased memory cost on this segment going forward by prioritizing monetization of the install base. That's us. That's you, the customer. Monetization is to date and striving to further expand our software and network service revenue. So one of my comments on this is, you know, how are they going about additionally monetizing the current install base? Well, they're doing that by things like the PlayStation Portal, the PSVR 2, the Pulse Elite headset, the Pulse Elite earbuds, you know, the line of headsets that they came out with, the monitors that they came out with, like the collector's editions, the special DualSense controllers, all those types of things. And so my question is, as you kind of go into this back half of the generation, how many more of those, right, moonshots do you really have to pull, right? How many more, you know, side panels and stuff, how many more of those do you have in the barrel? Because every time you introduce one, you know, the demand might decrease if you're kind of repeating a thing. Like if there's meat behind this notion of a PlayStation Portal OLED, then like I don't know how much traction that gets, you know. Being that you already put out the Portal, you probably have fewer customers in total for the PlayStation Portal OLED than you do for the PlayStation Portal itself, which has a 7% attach rate. You know, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. Yeah, but how many more of those tricks in the bag do you have? Your big thing is that you need hardware to drive sales through your digital storefront, right? So your plan is to sell more software, right? She says, where is it in here? Further expand our software and network service revenue. The way PlayStation does that primarily is through their own digital storefront, a little bit on Steam, where, you know, they get their 70% cut. But we already know that off-platform software sales only drive their revenue by about 2%, 2 point something percent, because they reported, I think last year, that they made like 600 something million, right, on off-platform software sales in comparison to their total 32.5 billion dollars that they make. So an incredibly small amount, to the extent where one might ask, why would they bother doing it at all? So what they need to do is they need to sell hardware. And like, I don't like this notion of like, well, there are only so many units behind like the PlayStation 4 sales. Like that's not pertinent. They need to sell hardware today. Nobody cares about the hardware that they sold 10 years ago. They need to move units today because that is the primary access point for people to conduct trade through the digital storefront that they own, where they capture 100% revenue. And so you've got to get those console numbers in the hands of people. And so you need to give people a reason to buy the hardware. I think in general, probably, the main corrective action they need is they probably need more than one first party title released per year. Exclusives, right? I don't think they need a huge amount. They don't need to pull an Xbox, right? They need like 2, because I think if you had Ghost of Yotei last year and then another tentpole single player narrative, high production quality, cinematic, right, single player game, I think your story is a little bit different, and that negative 4% overall is maybe not as big. Again, I don't think that they need to turn the world upside down. They're doing great on correcting the operating margin profit, but I don't think that what they want is to be down on revenue overall for the year, quarter after quarter. So this metric that has been put out, it's not a nothing burger. It's not something to be ignored. It's not like, oh, it's okay, right? Even my first cut was, well, I don't really care. And this is my take every time. I don't really care what happened in the quarter. What's the overall year? Because if we're net up overall in the year, but we have one bad quarter, then we work on fixing that quarter. And I'm still in the place where I think these are just things to tweak. Like I said, I don't think this is indicating like the corporation is failing or they're about to fold or PlayStation is cooked. But I do think that they have some things to work on. And that's in contrast to a lot of PlayStation fans that I will run into who feels like PlayStation can do no wrong. They never need to fix anything. They just need to keep doing what they're doing. No, that's not the case. You need to give people a reason to buy the hardware more so than you're doing right now as we're going into the back end of this generation. I think what we're starting to see is the quantitative impact of a live service strategy, an investment in that live service strategy that hasn't borne any fruit. And I think if we were standing here today having this conversation in a world where Concord had shipped and been successful, where if Marathon had shipped on time and been successful, Fair Games, and granted Fair Games didn't have a shipping date, but my presumption is with whatever like drama went down with Jade Raymond, that it's shipping later than it was originally planned to be. So I think if some of those games had come out and did something and contributed to the diversification of the portfolio, the variance in the content that's available, the engagement of a player base, and an attraction for a demographic of gamer that is increasingly interested in social interaction, then I think maybe we're having a different conversation. I'm sorry for the audio listeners, you didn't get a visual cue, so my throat was getting dry and I had to take a drink. So, of course, we just, like this week, had Horizon Hunters Gathering announced. And look, that game is not for me, but I do think that is the type of content that you need to pad your portfolio with to provide diversification. There's a lot of resistance amongst the PlayStation faithful, the old guard. And I said this at the outset of the generation. I said the biggest problem Sony is going to face in trying to widen their appeal to a broader consumer base is their diehard faithful fans, because their diehard faithful fans are the ones that insist that nothing needs to change, and they just need to keep doing what they're doing. And I think, like I said, there are some things in here that they need to tweak and they need to change. I think you do need to improve the cadence from your first party studios. And you need to do that by not distracting your S tier marquee first party studios with anything to do with multiplayer content. I think Guerrilla, I used to have Guerrilla, and I remember now, I used to have Guerrilla in my top 5 favorite studios of all time. I don't have them in there now. I may need to move them back, because I've always been super, like, Guerrilla is one of the few studios that I can account for that, you know, they spend a decade or whatever making a first person shooter, and they push back and they say, we don't want to do that anymore, we want to do something different, and they come out with this third person action adventure game with RPG elements that is successful by any commercial metric. I don't care about the Horizon nickelbacking. By any metric, that's a successful franchise. And most studios, 90% of studios in the industry, could not pull that off. Most studios, when they try and take on a new genre that's not in their bailiwick, are not successful. But, you know, they are participating, and I just don't know how heavily. Maybe it's not that much, you know, but they are involved to some extent with this Horizon Hunters Gathering. And I, as a PlayStation 5 player, and I think a lot of other people would prefer for them to be on, you know, the next Horizon game or whatever, like first person or single player content that they could be on. Now, that's not to say that you don't need live service. I think you do need live service in the Sony portfolio. You just need some other people to do it. Again, a lot of pushback on, you know, PlayStation doesn't need to do live service. No, they absolutely do, right? Because they don't have live service stuff of their own, you know, minus like the purchase of Bungie. They now have Helldivers. They need other types of content. They have, you know, whatever players they were going to attract by the tentpole single player franchise IP they have, and whatever that there's a way to calculate like what that, I'll call it, I don't know, attraction factor rate. There's a way to think about what percentage of new users they will attract by the presence of that content. But that amount is quantifiable, yes, but it's also finite, right? It has a limit. And so to attract more people to the platform, they need to further diversify the content portfolio. So part of what's going on, I think, based on the financials that have come out, is that there's more rallying around this notion of, see, they're down on hardware because kids only want to play on tablets and phones. And I think the big problem that is the truth behind why that is not true in the way that people posit it is because the causality that they are thinking of that pushes it is wrong. And most of that causality that they put behind it is that it's because kids don't care. They don't care about quality experiences. They don't care about 4K. They don't care about frames and performance. And I don't think that's true. I think that is a temporary state that they sometimes need to assume because of other factors. And let's talk about some of those other factors. The outlook of younger generations, and I'm going to isolate this discussion to America, but of course, America is a huge part of the console and PC industry, right? The outlook of younger generations has changed. And their perspective, at least for a certain runtime of their life, of their adult life, may not be one where the TV is the center of their future state vision. And what I mean by that is Gen Xers, right, grew up and they were conditioned to believe you grow up, you go to school, you get married, you have a nuclear family, 2 kids, right? And you buy a house. And the center of your household, your hearth, your social gathering place is the television. The television that replaced the radio for generations preceding it. The radio which replaced the fireplace for generations preceding it. But I think a big problem with current generations is that they don't see themselves as growing up and buying a house in their 20s and 30s. They probably only envision buying a house in their 40s. We'll talk about some of the demographics that have come out in industry data and market data as well. A lot of those people envision themselves living in households with multiple non-family tenants, roommates, right? And they perceive that may be their state through their 20s and 30s, through the early parts of their career, until they, exceed into management or, a senior career track. And then, think, lifetime milestone purchases like your big TV, like Gen Xers were trained, will be something that they'll maybe become concerned about. But so these kids don't play on tablets and phones necessarily because they prefer them or because they don't care about graphics or they don't care about 4K. They do it because they're personal devices and they don't have to, because they are a singularly owned resource. They do it because they don't have to fight with anyone about what gets watched on TV. They don't have to negotiate with anyone for gaming time on a communal resource, which is the television. That is the thing that's driving it, not the attribution that other people are giving to it. And what that means is that there are still going to be people. There are still going to be part of the demographic. There are still going to be members of the addressable market who want high-end graphics, high frame rates, 4K. And so you can't abandon that space. Some of the notion that I've seen of people saying, well, you want to go to PC, you want to stop doing consoles. I'm like, I don't know that I've ever been around a conversation where people have been proponents of abandoning a $46 billion business. I don't get it. I do not understand that. We are not in MP3 territory, right? We are not on this transitional electronic device that came up in between CDs and cassette tapes and then was promptly drowned out by the smartphone. Like, that's not what consoles are. And so I don't get why people, because MP3s never grew to be a $46 billion business. So I don't understand why people are constantly advocating that the right way is to abandon this thing. And I think they only do it because Xbox tells them to. It's just kind of silly. But the key thing is that for Gen Z and probably Gen Alpha behind them, something like the big TV, right? The high-end TV, 3D TV, 4K TV, like the thing that other people come over to your house and you show off. That thing is not a universally recognized aspirational milestone purchase in the way it may have been for previous generations. So again, I don't think it's a matter of that they don't care about quality, because there are studies that show that when those things are available, they do use them. There are multiple articles out there about the myths of Gen Z content consumption, that there's this perception that they only consume stuff on phones and that they only watch social media. They don't know, like the market research actually shows that when they are on those larger screen devices, they actually watch not traditional TV, but they watch TV shows. That's why TV shows have come back into vogue as being like a big deal. That's why they're part of the zeitgeist. And the other thing that you have to consider is when you talk about affordability and like devices that people want, because Gen Z is definitely a very digital device focused generation. But you have to consider the dynamics on the economy where everyone can afford a phone because the carriers give you an interest-free loan to buy a new phone versus the option of paying full price for a television that you may be in a dwelling situation that maybe arguably that's not necessarily what you need, or it's not a priority. Or if you purchase that television, like it may not be like solely yours, you know, so what are you gonna go in for it? Split it 4 ways to buy it. You know, that tends to never work well. Right. But that's the option. It's like you have this phone, which you're going to be credited, right? You're going to, the standard commercial model in America, right, is that this is the thing that you get indebted for, right? But everybody does it. Or you're going to go buy this TV. And what I will say is, for Gen X, when they were in their younger years, again, the TV was an aspirational lifetime milestone purchase, and a lot of them would get indebted, right, to get that nice TV. Gen Z, on the other hand, like I said, if they do go to college, is being saddled with more student loan debt, and so the idea of indebting themselves for a TV, I think, is less of a priority for them when they already indebt themselves for phones, because that's the standard. So the big question is, what does this mean for console manufacturers? I think right now represents a great time in gaming because, prior to some of the kind of wild AI, right, price impacts. But for years, what we've been saying since the start of the generation was that it's a great time to be in gaming because there are so many different avenues to get into gaming. And so maybe that's what console vendors need to continue expanding on. And so I think you could do that multiple ways. Like, I think companies can take the Samsung approach, or maybe to a lesser extent the Apple approach. And I think it's fine for you to have like a MacBook Air, a MacBook Pro, and a high-end MacBook Pro. Like, I think it's fine if a singular vendor takes the approach of having an entry-level console, a mainstream console, a prosumer console, right, and a pro console. Even though I've seen somebody like cracking jokes about like the PlayStation 5 Pro and pro gamers, whatever. Use common sense, and I think we know what those different levels mean. But I also think it's totally fine for that to be an industry approach. And what I mean by that is everybody doesn't need to make a high-end console. I think it's fine for 1 or 2 vendors to make a high-end console. I think it's fine for 1 or 2 vendors to make a low-end console. I think it's fine for 1 or 2 vendors to make one in between. But I think my main thing is that I think where we're approaching, as I alluded to when I talked about the sociological changes that are happening in the generations and the causality behind them, I think we're heading for a time when the addressable market, the consumer demographics, are going to experience a wider variation in what people want. And I don't think, we're going to see a loss of people who want high-end gaming. But I do think we're going to see a mix of people who maybe have different needs, right? Because of what's happening economically, what's happening sociologically. I think we're having a generation of people who just aren't going to be able to afford to buy houses. And so do you try and sell those people a high-end gaming device that necessitates or is made preferential by having a big screen, high-end television, if those people don't have a place to put it, right? Or have, adverse living conditions that make that not the optimal approach to have. Kind of like you have in the Asia countries, and yet we just talked last week, maybe the week before, about how Asia is the growth market, right? And what's selling biggest in Asia right now? The Switch 2. So we have these multiple ways to interact with gaming now. We have the PlayStation Portal. We have Switch and Switch-like devices that are dual use. I'm going to come back to the thing that I may have been wrong about years ago. Actually, I'm going to get into that now. But like, let's not go bonga with the notion of the dual use thing, right? What I mean by dual use is they need to be natively and organically engineered from the ground up to be a dual use device. And that dual use capability needs to not be an afterthought. My feeling is on the Switch and on the handheld Windows devices, that ability to hook it up to a larger screen is an afterthought. Right? It's an oh, by the way. And it's not always elegant, and it's not always the most performant. That's why Valve is making a Steam machine, right? Because the Steam Deck can do it, but it's not the most elegant solution. So if you engineer something from the ground up, like the Switch, to be both portable and to be able to transfer that experience to a larger screen, then that's the type of device I'm talking about. Now, the thing I may have been wrong about years ago, before I even got into the YouTube, Twitter circuit of foolishness, there was a person I remember there was an exchange that I had on Twitter with a person who was like the Switch is going to be the thing, like everybody's going to want dual use devices. And at the time I said, well, people aren't going to be willing to, like in aggregate across the market, be willing to make that power sacrifice in order to gain the mobility, because that mobility doesn't have the same value prop for every gamer in the demographic. I still think that, but I will definitely admit it's probably a stronger market force now than I gave credence to it, 7-8 years ago. And again, I was a huge proponent of the Nintendo Switch, but I felt that the Nintendo Switch didn't have that it had reach, but I didn't feel like reach was was overwhelming, right? But the other thing I do want to call out is that let's also remember that at a year or two into this generation, console generation 9, 60%, at least in America, 60% of Nintendo Switch owners also own an Xbox or a PlayStation. So let's also keep in mind it wasn't a primary console for almost 2/3 of its market. It was a secondary console. And I think that's a great fit from an affordability perspective. I always said that, hey, if you want to be a multi-platform gamer, I think a great approach is, buy a big boy set-top console, right, and buy a Switch. It's a great approach. So one thing that I do push back on is this notion that the answer is less powerful hardware. I have a really hard time with this demographic, with this voice track, because usually this voice track starts with people don't buy, right? Not enough people are moving off of PlayStation 4 to get to PlayStation 5 because they don't see a big enough difference. So I think what people aren't realizing is what they are saying is that the PS5 is not so powerful that it provides a big enough hardware differentiation to warrant for some people to feel, like a lot of people to feel, that it's warranted to make the move. So how are they going to feel that there's enough differentiation there in a less powerful device? That voice track, again, makes no sense because it's in absolute antithesis to each other, right? It just doesn't make sense. The answer is not less powerful hardware. The answer is not less powerful hardware for the entire market. What I'm saying is that I think the market is going to further fracture and further fragment, and you're going to get more and more niche verticals of different types of consumers that need more widely variated solutions than they are currently being given on the market. that hit at different price points. And I don't think any one of those, I think the shift we're making is we've been in a very consolidated console market. And this is one of the reasons why I pushed back against the acquisition. And I still feel like the market is partially broken because the PC and console gaming market, I can't remember what the figure is. I used to quote it a couple of years ago, but like something like, trying to remember what the figure was. It's something like the Steam figure. It's not as aggravated as the Steam figure, but it's something like the top. It's like the top 6 companies make, well, before the acquisition, it's only the top 6 companies made something like 69% or like low 80%, somewhere in there of the total revenue that the market makes, which means all of the other competitors were left to fight over the remaining like 20-30%. The acquisition has made that worse because in a $92 billion PC and console market in aggregate, you have 2 companies making, one of which just looking to make, $30 billion and the other of which is looking to make $20 billion. So out of a $90 billion something industry, you have 2 companies making over 50% of the available revenue. And that is where, in my mind, consolidation is a problem. But so we've existed very much in this time where in the console industry, everybody's needs are serviced by 3 platform owners, right? And largely across that market subsegment, combining PC and console, you have customers whose needs are primarily fulfilled by 4 platforms, 4 approaches, right? PC and the 3 console platform owners. And what I'm saying is I think we're drifting towards a time when people want different access points than that. People need different access points than that. But I don't think that means that people don't want to play at 4K 60, 4K 120. What I think people are looking for is for dual use devices, set-top consoles that cover a mix across the performance spectrum, and PCs. And I think there are people who want PCs who build them once and don't touch them for 7 to 10 years so they can play casual games, low poly games, low frame rate, 1080p, 60 frames per second, and they're fine with that. And then I think there's a smaller segment of the PC market who wants to play on an RTX 5080, 5090. But I think in aggregate, right, you need all those different ways to make people go. And I think we do need more, probably an increase in dual use devices like the Nintendo Switch. And so maybe that's what PlayStation is thinking of when they talk about these rumors of there potentially being a handheld. And maybe it's what Xbox was also thinking when they were planning on making their own handheld. So it'd be interesting to see how that goes. But at the end of the day, swinging back to PlayStation, there's been a lot of discussion to make this negative 4% revenue thing a nothing burger. And I don't think it's a nothing burger. Again, it was the report out of their holiday quarter, and the year end is coming in looking like they're going to be down 8 to 10%. Although admittedly their margin will be up. I think they need more first party titles. Again, not crazy more. They need like 1. They need like 2 first party tentpole exclusive titles. Because if you think back to like the PS3 generation when you had Infamous, Uncharted, Tilu, and their other franchises kind of banging away on this more frequent cadence, then I think things were better, and I think things would be going better for them from a market share perspective and growth perspective. I think they need more diversification. We've seen kind of an erosion of where they would do, I mean, they did Astrobot, but they're not doing anything else like Astrobot, right? They're definitely not doing things like Keeper and Kiln that are happening over on Xbox. So they've kind of eroded and given that up. And maybe that's fine, but I think they need something. I think they think that something now is the live service approach, and that's fine, but like, get them out, right? Field them, right? Get people playing them. I don't know what the approach is going to be on, what is this multiplayer thing? Horizon Hunters Gathering. I personally think it needs to be free to play. And I'm not one of these people who says, hey, if you put a $40 price tag on it, you're not, nobody's going to play it. That's not true, because we have $40 price tags on things that people play. Arc Raiders, Helldivers 2, incredibly successful. So I don't think $40 automatically dooms your game to nobody playing it. But with where PlayStation is now, where they haven't fielded a new live service game, I'm sorry, that's not true, because they obviously have Helldivers 2. But where that's been the only thing that they've fielded, I think maybe what you want is you want to get as many of those 92.2 million people who own PlayStation 5s playing your multiplayer game. And maybe in this one instance, the right and best way to do that is to make it free to play. But my big thing about hardware is, I don't think you want to continue to be down. I don't think you want to continue to backslide. And my thing is, yes, this is the back half of the generation, and you may have already predicted that you were going to have a hardware problem. But in past generations, there would have been other levers that you could have pulled. You would have tried to get sweetheart deals right through your supply chain to get component purchases down. That's not happening in this environment. You would be trying to push your manufacturer to give you a better deal on manufacturing costs with the argument that, hey, it shouldn't be costing you as much to make those consoles now. And you would therefore improve your profitability and your margin on the console. You would probably introduce a new lower cost SKU. But none of those three things you're going to do. So there's none of those three things that are going to happen to make this problem better. Right? There's none of those three levers that you're going to pull to give that last 2-year boost in demand to keep the console sales going at the level that you need them to. And I don't think they're going to introduce a lower cost SKU because they didn't cut the cost of the base and the digital when they introduced the Pro this time around. So most of my problem with, I think, the way people will think about this and the way that they will rail against it and they will get angry out of my suggestion that PlayStation needs to change anything is that you can't just continue to be down, right? It's not like, if you think PlayStation doesn't need to change anything, then there's a limited set of things that you believe. You either believe that it's okay for a business to be flat and for that needle to not move with a growth perspective. And so sure, being flat is not the same as moving backwards like Xbox is doing, right? Or you think that it's okay for them to be showing negative revenue multiple quarters in a row and multiple years in a row. And if you've worked in management or leadership at the executive level anywhere in corporate America, you know that that's not the case. So you either believe in something that is just patently untrue, or you're just sticking your head in the sand and choosing to ignore the problem. My point is, this negative 4% thing this quarter and the negative 8 to 10% for the year, if PlayStation stands still and doesn't tweak anything, then there's nothing happening that just makes that just alleviate itself and go away. There's nothing that makes the monster go back in the box. There's a limited possibility that maybe the backslide on hardware will settle out and achieve equilibrium, right? That you sold 8 million consoles and maybe that's as far backwards as you're going to go, and you're going to continue to sell 8 million consoles. That's a possibility. There are a lot of people attributing this down quarter to, well, people were just tight-fisted this quarter. And that's possible. That's a possibility too. But here's my thing in business. And you can go talk to anybody who sits at a decision-making level. Probably true that most often decision makers and leaders don't look at stuff. We call them controllable and uncontrollable forces. You probably don't look at all your uncontrollable forces and just hope and pray that problems will fix themselves. You usually, because most of these people in these positions are type A personalities, right? You usually seek to find a thing that you can control, a thing that you can tweak, and you try and point the ship in the direction that you think is most suited to sail it out of danger. You typically just don't leave those things up to chance. Now, where's the impact of this? I don't think this is a 2026 problem because you've got GTA 6 and you've got Wolverine coming out. So this is not hugely impactful and not in your face in 2026, which is good because the whole point of this is that if you recognize it early, you have time to wind up, right, and get ready for the pitch. In 2027, they have Intergalactic. I'm not sure what else they have. But I don't think Intergalactic, at least for me, from a subjective perspective, from a consumer perspective, I don't feel like Intergalactic it's Naughty Dog, yes. But I also don't feel like it's TLU level. I'm not sure that it's Uncharted level. Brap and I made this insinuation a few months ago, and again, people got mad. I don't feel going... sorry. I don't feel going into these bottom 2 years of the generation that we are at TLU 2 Ghost of Tsushima hype level like we were to close out PlayStation 4. And so I think there needs to be another zinger in there. I don't know what it is. I certainly don't feel like it's... I keep forgetting the name of this thing that shows you how much I think about it. I don't think it's Horizon Hunter's Gathering. Like, I don't think that's the sauce. You know? So again, these are all things that have time to be revealed. These are all things, and so you can push the I believe button, the I trust button, and think that this is a nothing burger and it's just going to be fine. But you know, most of those thoughts that, you know, this will be fine, it's not a big deal, that's being spoken by the people who are already in the ecosystem. But it's not just about you. Lynn thinks it's about you in terms of she wants to monetize you more. So she wants to get you to buy more software. And you're not going to buy more software unless there's more software to be bought of the type that you're looking for. And the reason why you're here in the first place is because of those first-party tentpole titles. So in order for her to monetize you more, she has to have more of those titles available. She has to have more of those titles in inventory. She has to have more of those titles on the digital shelf for you to go buy. But it's also about attracting new customers in. And so new customers need to also be attracted by those additional titles that are coming out that have the panache, and when they're demoed, when they're shown, give you the flash and splash that you need to encourage people to buy hardware. They need to be system sellers. Now, all that being said, they're obviously not experiencing the same problems that Xbox is experiencing. Xbox's problem is a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth that they're trying to change strategy, which they've been talking about since 2024 and earlier. But they came out and they did the business update in February of 2024, at the end of February 2024. And basically they alluded to that they were changing strategy. And they continued to walk that further and further and further, right off the previously beaten path throughout the year. You know, it was, you know, we're shipping 4 titles, but I'm not going to say that nothing, you know, I'm not going to say that any title is never going to go, to there's no red line, to just everything was going, right? So they walked that dog. And all along the way, they were incredibly loud. And in my case, in my perspective, incredibly arrogant. You know, one of Satya Nadella's big things about cultural change right now is he's been talking about, you know, when he first came in, there was this notion of one Microsoft, right? And it was to beat down these factions and these fiefdoms that existed at Microsoft. You know, it's one of the reasons, gosh, what is the guy's name? I can see his face and I cannot remember his name. Never mind. I got Steven Sinofsky, right? It's one of the reasons why Steven Sinofsky was kind of walked out, was because he was of that old guard and he believed in those silos, and he believed in, you know, just doing what he needed to do to get ahead without consideration of, you know, without playing well with others. And Satya wanted to change that. Well, his newest initiative has been wanting to get Microsoft to no longer be the company, right? He wants them to no longer be the people who walk into the room with briefcases acting like they know more than everyone else. But Goram, if that's not exactly how they've been acting with their voice track with regards to gaming, like they have absolutely been coming out and saying, this is the way we perceive things and everyone else has it wrong and we're the ones who are right. And they've been embarking on that path down that change strategy for a year. And it is not working as tangibly represented by their Q3 or Q2 FY26 earnings report. And more importantly, if you look at that slide in the Bloomberg, that chart in the Bloomberg article, what it shows is it shows a negative inflection with regards to growth that has been occurring since early 2025. Interestingly, after they put Call of Duty in Game Pass, that has had their growth trajectory in the negative for a year. And is continuing on that path. And so it was actually moving in the opposite direction before the acquisition. Then they got a huge 60% growth spike from the acquisition, and then kind of flattened out. And these are things you can see if you do a I forget what it's called. I called it out last time for some reason. I'm forgetting my high school geometry. But you do a line fit right in between the points on the curve, right, to just make it a single line. And you can see that it's a negative trajectory, right, from Q1 of 2025. So that's a problem for Xbox. That's not the same problem PlayStation is having. It's definitely not the same magnitude. But again, what I said is that there are sociological things, there are economic things going on that are causing people to make different choices because they don't have other options. And so what the industry needs to do is they need to respond by giving people other options. One of the things that I call out, right, again, for people who say PlayStation doesn't need to change anything, that you just keep doing the same thing. I think most people are unfamiliar with the 30-year history that, period of time that I've been, blogging and doing content creation, studying Sony, and it actually goes back further than that. But they don't think about all of the failures of Sony. And so one of the penchants of Sony in their culture is that they have had these successes and they get on that horse and they ride it until that horse is expired and can't run anymore. And what they do in an almost very BlackBerry-like fashion is they don't see the next thing coming and they don't change. So this is my concern with PlayStation. Back at the beginning of this generation, when before the live service strategy thing, quite frankly, when Jim Ryan was saying, we believe in console generations, we think that our customers will pay, we think we just need to keep doing what we've been doing. My fear is that's what I was hearing. I was hearing the same philosophy from all these other ventures that had gone south. Things like Betamax, the memory card, Walkman, Discman, mini disc, CDs, Blu-ray, Xperia, Vio, UMDs, and now TVs. And TV's not the same exit, but they're doing a venture partnership with TCL. But yeah, it's kind of in the same thing, right? And my point is that they keep squeezing that fruit until there's no more juice to be gained, and they don't change anything. And then they just fold up that business, that value stream, or they sell it off, which is what they did with Vio. Or they minimize it like they've done with Xperia to now where they're only building one phone, although there are rumors that they're going to start building more phones. CD, Walkman, Discman, mini disc. They rode that horse and they didn't see the coming of the digital age. I put Blu-ray in that category because Blu-ray was a great thing when it came along, and then literally on the a fortnight after they launched it, made a really big deal about it. People became more concerned about digital, and Sony doesn't really have a big streaming service. So they do these things, they're successful, but then they just, like I said, they just ride them on that same model and they don't think about the changes they need to make. That's not what PlayStation's been doing. PlayStation is thinking about changes they need to make. And all I'm saying is that I think these are parts of the mix. I think some of them they're already thinking about. If they're doing the handheld, I think that's why they're doing it. Because they have a sense that demographics are shifting and that people still want a game. People still want pay to have access to marquee content. They don't want geedunk. They don't want mobile games. They don't want swipe, right? They don't want idle time wasters because they think that there's still people who sit down for 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours for a chunk of time and dedicatingly play video games. They're still trying to run a platform business that I don't think is obsessed with competing with TikTok like Xbox is. And so I think all I'm saying is I think it behooves them, and we think they're moving in this direction already, to then give people multiple access points, multiple ways for them to interact and be part of that ecosystem at different price points. So hopefully that's the direction that they're going in. Some of the quotes from Matt Piscatella, I think he made these last year shortly after his podcast that he showed up on Kind of Funny Games Daily, because this was also in February of 2025, I think. May have been February 2024, I'm not sure. One of his quotes, high-income households are becoming a bigger part of the U.S. console hardware market. 49% of U.S. video game console buyers during Q4 2024 had a household income of at least $100K per year. This is a record high, beating the 48% seen in Q4 2021. This group accounted for only 29% of video game hardware purchasers in Q1 2020. 45 and over year old buyers accounted for 45% of U.S. console purchasers during Q4 2024, also a record high. Under 44 year old buyers made up 55% of console purchasers in the quarter, a record low. During Q1 2020, under 44s made up 69% of purchasers, with 31% being 45 and over. Console buyers, y'all are getting old, but at least you seem to be making more money. So you have that going for you, which is nice. So a lot of people have kind of been jumping on this, that in the label as console generations are getting older. Maybe you can label it that way. I think the way I think about it is that it's when people get to a certain age that they hit the promotions or the work levels, career check levels, where they have the disposable income to go buy nice things without that feeling like an adversity, right, or a challenge. And so a lot of people say console gamers are getting older. I don't necessarily know that I see it that way. What I see it is that the sliding window of where people and when people make the choice is becoming later. But I mean, that also happened with people getting married and people having kids, right? People are doing that at older ages. So unless there's not a generation of people coming behind them that will also become 40 and also have 100K salaries and therefore also buy consoles. I mean, this is part of my problem with like a lot of these statistics and the data that come out, is they don't follow the demographic, right? So they'll say Gen Z doesn't do a thing. Okay. What we actually know is Gen Z doesn't do a thing when they're 20 years old. What do we know about Gen Z when they're 30? What do we know about Gen Z when they're 40? And do we have reason to believe that Gen Z when they are 40 won't do the same thing that the millennials and Gen X did when they were 40? Because normally that's what the generations do, and that's why companies continue building those products and running those business models. We don't typically radically change, right, business models and content on a generational basis. Otherwise, you would see these massive upheavals, right, every 7 to 14 years. And we're not doing that. We do see some evolution and we do see some change. But I don't necessarily know that the evolution needs to be a revolution, and that again, that there needs to be this all hands abandoned ship and let's all jump out of a $46 billion business, right? And make TikTok content that's suitable for mobile phones, for gamers, that we think exists behind different screens. So I think the other thing that I have a problem with about some of the doom and gloom is that I think the problem that people and gaming companies, when they're talking about this stuff and talking about like the gaming industry is changing and people don't want that, they want this, which happens to align with people don't want what the other guy is selling. They want the thing that I'm selling. So of course, the companies would say that. They think that the market is going to go belly up due to changing consumer habits. And again, like I just said, I don't think that's what's going to happen. It's going to get upended by the innovation that no one sees coming, right? It's going to be upended by the holodeck or some other immersive experience, not the common basic things I think a lot of people are guessing, and some companies are very loudly proclaiming. Right? You're going to get scooped by the innovation you don't see coming. That's why it's called an innovation. That's why you get scooped. That's why it's a revolution. If you could see it coming, then you would probably already be doing it yourself, right? And therefore, like, the industry wouldn't get disrupted. So, okay. I think that covers everything that I wanted to talk about with regards to PlayStation. I'm going to try and run through this other stuff quicker because I actually took all of my time going and preparing for that and didn't have time to really get into anything else. Let's go talk about some of the other information that came out in PlayStation financials. I don't know that there's anything huge that I wanted to go through in these. I talked about the revised guidance. Thought there was one thing that I wanted to look at in here. I think the only thing that was in here was actually, I think their guidance was in here because I didn't see it in the slides. But then we actually caught it while we were going through the slides. And I think we caught everything else. So I actually I don't think there's anything in that financial statement we need to go through. There was some interesting stuff in the supplemental information. And I kept looking for where it's in writing from a Sony source, the 92.2 million PlayStation 5 sold, and I have not been able to find it. And I've gone through the earnings slide deck, the consolidated financial report. So I think this will be there. I can't remember. I think in the US it's a 10C. And I think in IFRS it's like a Form 28 or something like that. So I've gone through their actual financial statement submission and I didn't see it. Then they had the supplemental financial data document and I didn't find it in there either. So I'm guessing it's out there. I'm not putting my fingers on it. But what was in here, what was interesting in here to me was some of the other information they provided. And this is where people got the breakdowns of the hardware and the software number, which I'm not as concerned about. I mean, software was up, and like I said, so they're not having the Xbox problem where Xbox was negative on the holiday quarter for games and services, or content and services, whatever they call it. People maybe they put the 92.2 million together by finding a past total and then probably adding up these quarterly million unit sales, which I didn't do. Yeah, this was the table that I found the most interesting in here. Cumulative sell-through units of selected first-party software titles. Now the thing is it would have been more interesting if they'd continued reporting, but they just have snapshots in here. Not actually, so like when they reported the Ghost of Yotei number in October of 2025, in November of 2025, it hasn't been revised. So it sold 3.3 million units as of November 2nd of 2025. You would think obviously it continued to sell more units, but we don't know exactly how much that was. The God of War numbers were the thing that I found most interesting. So when God of War, I guess this was the 2018. I don't know why. When I was talking to somebody about it earlier today, I thought it was the Ragnarok number. When the game launched in 2018, only on PlayStation 4, within 2 days, it sold 3.1 million units. By a month later, it had sold 5 million units. And over the following 15 months, it sold another 14 million units. And then for another year thereafter, when it shows up on PC, this is actually before, it includes the first almost year of sale on PC, it had gone to 23 million units. So God of War is a title that, across PlayStation 4 and PC, as of November of 2022, it had sold 23 million units. So what was most impressive about that was the sustained tail from launch all the way through it getting on PC. I thought that was pretty impressive. And so that's one of the things I should have also mentioned, with regards to hardware. Again, there's a lot of discussion around the PlayStation 6 now and a feeling that gamers don't need the PlayStation 6. And I want to say, I think with regards to the numbers that I walked through, what I talked about is, well, maybe you don't need a PlayStation 6, but I think PlayStation maybe does. Again, to give people a reason to buy a console, because it would be a new hardware set with significant enough differentiation that people sitting on PlayStation 4s would feel the need to upgrade. Now, maybe that's the future of PlayStation 2, is they already have, like, the difference with the situation they're in now is they have people who are living off planet on PlayStation 4, right? But that problem was unintentional. I don't think that was the plan. And so maybe part of their future is managing it more directly and knowing that they're going to have a cross-generational dynamic coming up, which I think they do. And so you're going to be fielding PlayStation 6 and PlayStation 5. And your PlayStation 5 in-service timeline is now not 7 years, right? But it's actually longer. And so your content strategy aligns more firmly to that. And out and away from the traditional of, yes, there's always been a little bit of a cross-generational impact, but like very much sooner in a console generation, you pulled that trigger where you said, yeah, I'm not developing games for that old console anymore. So maybe that'll be part of the mix. Probably more quickly going to run through Nintendo sales. The Nintendo Switch 2, so this news article over on Game Developer, the Nintendo Switch 2 has topped 17 million sales worldwide. Meanwhile, the original Nintendo Switch has become the best-selling console in Nintendo history. The Nintendo Switch 2 continues to outpace its predecessor after selling 17.37 million units worldwide. As noted in Nintendo's fiscal report for the past 9 months, the console launched on June 5th, 2025, and reached that milestone on December 31st, 2025. For context, the original Switch sold 17.79 million units by March 2018, just over a year after it hit shelves on March 3rd, 2017. Sticking with the Switch 2 for a moment, Nintendo said hardware sales were driven by the Nintendo Switch 2 plus Mario Kart World Bundle and Nintendo Switch 2 and Pokemon Legends ZA Nintendo Switch 2 Edition Bundle. Lots of other stuff in here, but I'm trying to kind of move quickly through this. I thought their slides were in here. Maybe they weren't. Yeah. So these are their actual... I tried to grab their actual charts. But I think the big takeaway here is, revised guidance for FY26 is that they expect to sell 19 million Switch 2 units. They are well on the way to doing that. Probably very likely that they'll sell another 1.63 million over the next 2 months, because their fiscal year closes out at the end of March. So I don't think that's going to be a problem. They're obviously doing well. I think it also defeats the narrative that exclusives don't matter, because that's what the entirety of the Nintendo business is built upon. So I don't know that there's a ton more to say about Nintendo other than, business is healthy right now. Obviously, they've got to navigate this timeline of, potentially higher component prices. And I mean, the general voice track right now is that both Nintendo and PlayStation are taking measures to secure stock so that they don't have to do any price increases this year in calendar year 2026. And then we'll have to see, how things are and where things are at the end of the year. This news story over on Game Rant, Nintendo stock price just took a big hit. We kind of had another one of these a couple of weeks ago, and I mentioned that, yeah, it's at the time, and I didn't have a chance to look at the chart. At the time, it was a hit in comparison to their, all-time high. I can't remember exactly what year that was, but it really wasn't the significance that people were lending it to, because they were drawing it in comparison to a peak, which was like a couple of years ago. And so there was some commentary here. Yeah, so an analytics company, Canton Games, told GameRant in an email that the values have dropped because Nintendo isn't meeting expectation from investment firm and analysts, despite the overall promising figures. It's all mainly about revenue and profit. People take the average predictions for these parameters provided by analysts from investment firms and form this consensus. Nintendo did generally have great numbers on the surface, but failed consensus stock almost always drops. Sometimes the company matches or even exceeds the consensus and the stock drops anyway because of macro factors, bad unemployment numbers, bad political news, etc., that play a role. Other times it can happen based on what you wrote. Investors may think a company has peaked for now and good news is exhausted, so they sell and move on. So I think this is all driven by people kind of getting spooked by the notion that component prices are going to make Nintendo raise prices. So, I mean, stock price is a thing. Stock price is not necessarily in its entirety the same exact thing as market cap. And it's not really earnings. So I think earnings is mostly what we pay attention to. I don't know. This is just a data point. And this is actually happening to kind of all tech companies across the board. There's kind of a bit of an abandoned ship moment as people are getting concerned. It's kind of like when you see investment bleeding out of a market because people, take it and stuff it over in stocks, or during the time where like the U.S. economy was looking, not that great in the early 2000s. You saw a lot of people pulling money from the U.S. and investing it overseas. So, like I said, just a data point. I haven't really had a chance to further break that down and see if there's anything worth really pulling out of this. I just caught the statements by the CEO of the analytics company about kind of what was going on and what was driving it. Like I said, the concerns about console hardware costs stem from an announcement by Micron, blah, 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 blah. I think we've been over that rather exhaustively. Ubisoft, more bad sentiment on the horizon because they just had a big town hall meeting. There was one kind of pertinent insight here that I wanted to pull out. Ubisoft's internal town hall meeting, this news article over on GameSpot by Levi Winslow. Ubisoft's internal town hall meeting still leaves employees concerned. CFO Frederick Dujay reportedly said selling any of the 5 newly established creative houses is a possibility in the future should it underperform versus management expectations. That was my one big insight that I wanted to pull out. It was right at the top. As Ubisoft undergoes a massive shakeup that's impacting the well-being of its employees, the company staff has said that I don't even know where I was reading. Oh, company staff said that a recent internal town hall meeting didn't assuage concerns about their futures. Ubisoft held an internal town hall meeting on February 4th, according to a recording of the town hall sent to Insider Gaming, and a dozen anonymous employees who spoke to the outlet. Employee morale is sinking. They said that the meeting was an expert class in dodging questions as executives opted to sidestep inquiries and recycle statements around 3 key issues: the return to office mandate, headcount reduction intentions, and the 5 creative houses creation. Look, I'm not going to cover the return to work mandate. Like, I think at this point people should understand, and particularly again professional salaried knowledge workers who are dealing with this, and you should understand your corporate culture and environment and expectations and make a decision about what you're going to do about it. But the big thing is this thing by Dujay. Lastly, Dujay discussed the 5 creative houses Ubisoft established to oversee various franchises and projects. You know that the company wants these teams to succeed, and then they might not be profitable on day one. Should they continue to underperform versus management expectations, though, he confirmed that selling a house is certainly a possibility as long as the sale is good for the house or Ubisoft in its long-term vision. And so the thing that, that this caused me to think is, I think we spent a lot of time worried about like how the creative houses were constructed and what IPs were under there. And now I'm, based on these statements, I'm having the realization, no, actually, I think those things were being positioned for sale. He talks about that it's a possibility. I am pretty sure in their mind, it's beyond possibility, right? I'm pretty sure in their mind, they think, oh yeah, we're definitely folding up shop on one of these things and selling it. And I think in very short order, we're going to see them kind of fishing expeditions to see who would be interested. And I think a lot of it is being done in the way the deal is being constructed is to shield the Guillermo brothers from any loss, and minimize the impact, right? Because it's actually not the Guillermo brothers themselves who own Ubisoft. They have I can't remember exactly what the company is. I'll just call it a holding company, but they have an LLC that is an entity that is a representative business that is the thing that actually owns Ubisoft or owns some significant number of shares in Ubisoft. And so they are distanced from this thing by like 2 or 3 arm reaches, in terms of how it could, possibly impact them. The original investment from Tencent was not in Ubisoft. It was actually in this holding company, that the Guillermo brothers do own directly. That is the thing that actually holds shares in Ubisoft. Now, Vantage Studios, I think that is a situation where it is a direct investment from Tencent into Ubisoft with some number of shares. And I think that thing is actually, I don't know exactly how that's constructed because they talk about that being a like separate business deal, but I think in some ways it still rolls up to Ubisoft ownership. But Tencent is directly invested in Vantage Studios, so I'm not exactly sure how that's constructed. But my main thing out of here was, yeah, I think these things are being set up to be sold off in a very kind of THQ embracer approach. So I do wonder if we're approaching a point where one day Ubisoft will only be Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and Rainbow Six Rogue Spear. I listened to Kind of Funny Games Daily this week, and there was one guest on there who felt, and again, I'm not, she's entitled to her opinion. I just have a different assessment and analysis. She felt that, the problem with Ubisoft is that it had kind of abandoned anything other than like its tentpole IPs. And I'm like, I don't think that's the case. Like, I don't know how you look at Riders Republic, the Crew Motorfest, Skull and Bones, and like I can't have the perspective that the only thing they care about is Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and Rainbow Six Siege. The Division 2 is, in my mind, one of their best games right now, and is definitely better than the Division 1, in my opinion, although people have problems with the Dark Zone, but I didn't play a ton of Dark Zone, and I don't play a ton of Dark Zone. I'm considering the game on the merits of a single-player campaign, and it's co-op, and I think that is better than the Division 1. So I don't know that I can personally have the feeling that they've abandoned like anything outside of the stuff that they put under Vantage Studios. I feel like that's absolutely not the case. In fact, I worry that the biggest problem with Ubisoft is that I can't follow the dollars in a way that would make sense to me, that makes Riders Republic or Skull and Bones make sense. In terms of like, I have to believe that that's not profitable, right? That it's not, that it's, maybe it's profitable, but like barely, like breaking even, maybe. Like, I can't see how that's a big thing. But again, Ubisoft has this stick-to-itiveness where they stand next to something and they build communities and they invest and they deliver content. I don't necessarily get it or understand it, and I can't follow the breadcrumbs to where I'm convinced overwhelmingly that makes sense. So I don't believe that they've abandoned like things outside the big tentpole IPs. In fact, I think it's the stuff that they're doing that's outside the big tentpole IPs that could be the problem, and maybe that's why those things were put off in these other creative houses by themselves. The last thing I'll read out here is over on The Gamer, by an article by Sam Woods. 80 of Japan's 100 best-selling games last year were on the Switch or Switch 2. Nintendo's dominance in Japan really knows no bounds. 2 weeks ago, Japanese magazine Famitsu released its findings on the top 10 best-selling physical games in the country of 2025, with the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2 games taking up 7 of the spots. Now the magazine has expanded its findings from the top 10 to the top 100, and probably unsurprisingly, Nintendo is still dominant. Of the top 164 were physical games sold on the Nintendo Switch, with a further 16 on the Switch 2. The chart tracks individual SKUs, so some games like Pokemon Legends ZA appear twice, but it's a great indication of just how well the company is performing in its homeland. 41 of the top 50 come from Nintendo, with Monster Hunter Wilds, Ghost of Yotei, Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD 2D Remake, Destiny Warriors Origins, Death Stranding 2, Like a Dragon, Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii, Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater, Silent Hill F, and Elden Ring Night Reigns. PS5 versions taking up the other 9 spots. One PS4 game, Like a Dragon, Pirate Yakuza in Hawaii, in 55th made the charts, and unsurprisingly, given the poor uptake of the hardware in the country, no Xbox games made the list. So I thought this was pretty interesting, and again, shows the strength of Nintendo, the Nintendo Switch platform, and how it's gaining traction. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes. There were some thoughts that, we're kind of getting back to the point where maybe there is a bit of head-to-head competition between the Nintendo Switch 2 and the PlayStation 5. I don't necessarily know that I believe that that's the case, or that that's the case in any kind of large, quantifiable metric of the matter. But, we will see how it goes. A lot of it depends on what games show up on Nintendo. I didn't talk about the Nintendo Direct. I actually kind of liked the show and the content that was shown there. I thought it was very super interesting that Xbox closed out the show. And that, 4 kind of big Xbox titles are making their way. I think it's 4. Indiana Jones, the Fallout remake thing, the Oblivion remake. I thought there was one other title coming to Switch 2 that I can't remember off the top of my head. But I'm glad they finally showed up to the party. I would have thought with, all of the, again, very loud rhetoric of support, sending games to other platforms, that, they would have been there on day one. But, better late than never. Okay, I think that's going to do it for me for tonight. Thanks so much for anybody who happens to swing through and watch the archive version of the show on the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube. Please feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can just receive a notification whenever you post new content. Gosh, not whenever you post new content, whenever I post new content. Again, you can tell how late at night it is, and that my day started very early with the gym, and I am very much having cognitive dissonance here as we close things out. So, once again, my name has been Game Logic for the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. That show normally airs Sunday nights at 8 p.m., but because it is Super Bowl Sunday, we're actually shifting the show to Monday. So we'll be on Monday at 8 p.m. I'm pretty sure. Sometimes we have to delay it to 8:30 because it's a work day, but it should be at 8 p.m. on Sunday, the 9th of February. So thanks so much for everybody who takes a look at this. I appreciate you. Until next time. Oh, one thing I want to say, I know I got some comments on the last video, I think, that I just didn't get a chance to respond to, so I apologize for that. I'll try to get back to being engaged with any comments that come through on this episode. So until next time, good night, good luck, and good gaming. That's going to do it for me. I'm out of here.
Yeah. Yeah.